I remember the first time that a plant spoke to me and told me its name. And I was out in one of my favorite places in the wild where I just liked to go to be with nature, and was sitting by this river and just staring at this lovely plant that I found so intriguing and just was really mesmerized by it. And the plant told me its name. And I was like, and so I took note of it. And then when I got back to quote unquote civilization, I looked the plant up on my phone and was really surprised that the plant had told me its name. It was like this shocking moment.
Hello, and welcome back to the Balanced and Blissful Energies podcast. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hechavarria, and today I have Bonnie D'Arcangelo with me. Bonnie is an herbalist and a anthroposophist. She's also an astrologer, and she has a beautiful way that she's blended all of these things together in her life to develop medicine for application topically. So Bonnie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm a clinical herbalist, which basically means that I have my own clinical practice, and the largest portion of the modalities that I use for my clients is herbal medicine. I do use other modalities like supplements if I feel that they're really nutrient deficient, but I also find that herbs can provide all of the nutrients and minerals that we need if we know how to extract them from the plant properly. And then I have an herbal products company in which my husband and I have use a lot of our background in anthroposophy to deliver or to create an advanced delivery method for herbal products. And so we have found it to be highly effective, sometimes more effective than taking things internally. And I like to explain topical application is our skin is the largest organ of our body. And it is constantly absorbing things from our outer world, be it toxins or even nutrients. And if some people are aware, there are supplement patches that you can take, and they use a transdermal application to deliver supplements. You also have nicotine packages. So there is some kind of puts that in people's mind to help them associate this kind of transdermal application when you could think about those patches that are constantly being absorbed into the body. And so what my husband and I have created is a patent pending formula that uses silica, which is the forgotten macronutrient that is essential to nearly every aspect of the function of the human body. We've used that as a delivery method to help to drive herbal ingredients deeper into the body. And what this does is it bypasses the people's digestive system. And depending on your own personal gut health and your body's metabolic processes is going to depend on how much of those either supplements or herbal products that you ingest that your body is actually going to absorb and use. And I found in my clinical practice that people are just so sick and nutrient deprived that I have to have a way to get them into their system while bypassing those metabolic processes so that I can guarantee I get a higher rate of absorption. And so I have found it to be very effective to use things topically to help my clients with a wide range of ailments.
Wow, cool. And can I ask you then, before we get into the details of topicals versus, because it is a whole deep discussion, but first I want to touch on uh, the herbs themselves, the plants that you work with. How do you select them? In my studies of anthroposophic medicine, we do deep plant studies where we get maybe over the course of 4 days observation, kind of like a Guthian thing, right? Like a strict observation, then getting into more of like the feeling sense, so more on the more emotional level, and then finally trying to understand the entirety of the plant on a whole gesture level. How do you go about selecting the plants, and do you have favorites?
Absolutely have favorites. So we're going to say that quietly because my herb cabinet's right next to me. None of them here up. So I'll start by prefacing that I really believe in the consciousness of plants. and that each plant is a conscious living being and can become our ally if we partner with it and we treat it as a conscious living being that not only we need, but needs us and wants to be needed in our lives. And so there are definitely ways to deepen our connection to plants in general or to a particular plant if you find you have one that you resonate with. There are meditative practices that are taught by teachers like Rudolf Steiner and the Anthroposophical Society that can help you to dive deep into that plant's consciousness. And the other big thing that is a little bit more surface level is our ability to communicate with a plant. And the best way to communicate with a plant is through touch and proximity. And, I have a master's of science degree and I'm currently getting my doctor of science degree. So a lot of my background is in scientific evidence that supports a lot of these concepts. And I love that so much that science can prove some of these more esoteric spiritual concepts. And so, one of the things that I really love is that science has actually shown that when a plant is repeatedly touched on one side of it, that it will actually grow towards that direction and strengthen itself in that direction of touch. And the same thing has been shown in scientific studies when plants are spoken to or plants are played music to, and that their environment and the energy surrounding them depends on how well they'll thrive. And so I like to relate that back to like a small child. When a small child is in a loving, supportive environment and is nurtured, it's going to flourish versus if it's in a negative and demeaning environment, it's not going to thrive in the same way. And plants are the same. And so for me, growing my plants in my garden is one of my deepest ways of connecting with them and their medicine. But in my clinical practice, I use probably close to 80, 90 different plants on a regular basis, and then some a little less frequency because their uses maybe are more limited to very specific conditions. And so it does come down to having kind of a relationship and understanding a plant. And I understand that in two ways. I understand the science behind the plant. So I know the plant's chemical makeup and its constituents. But then there's also our olfactory senses. How does it smell? How does it taste? And if you're a very intuitive person, how do you feel when you're around that plant? And I definitely have a couple plants, and if you follow me on YouTube, you'll see me with some of my plants in their jars, and I'm just, like, hugging them, and I'm like, "I love this plant so much." It just has a resonating energy with it, and I think that when you're using herbal medicine, it's really important to find those plant allies that you feel a deep connection to. And we're going to go back to where science supports connection with plants. Science has also shown that when a human is growing a plant and they're in proximity of each other, that the plant recognizes that the human is caring for it and will actually create more of the constituents that it knows that person needs as medicine. And so our plants are highly intuitive and tuned into us as well. And so I always encourage people, you don't have to have, a massive garden growing every variety of herbal plant possible. You can have just one or two or three plant allies, and those plants will help to support you as you help to support them.
Mm. Yeah, there's also stories of like, or maybe not stories, I think there's actually scientific studies where the plants somehow detect when their owner is coming back to take care of them. And so that's like, yeah, also going another step. But going back to the more scientific level, you mentioned the um, chemical constituents. Some of them are going to have a scent, some of them are going to have a flavor. And now this can start tying into the dermal or skin application because we now know that there are taste and olfactory receptors on the skin, and they have direct functions, not in the conscious sense that we can taste them with our skin, but they do affect our immune system. They affect the skin cells. They help regenerate skin. How do you use the plants that you choose specifically for skin conditions, or do you use them for general conditions?
I think when it comes to the plants, and this is where like my strong background in the science behind herbal medicine comes into play, is understanding those constituents is one helps me understand how to extract those properties. So for instance, like monoterpenes are typically the plant constituents that we're familiar with in essential oils. And those are the constituents of a plant that have a very strong scent. And so, if you're going for the monoterpenes for the healing factor in a particular type of monoterpene in a plant, you're going to want to use the essential oils. Or if you're looking for the sesquiterpenes or the alkaloids. So those that science kind of informs whether I'm going to use a water extract or an alcohol extract, or maybe I'm going to do a water extract and then follow it up with an alcohol extract because I know that there's constituents in both places that I want to get out of the plant, and then understanding how those are going to be absorbed in the body. So an alcohol extract of a plant the alcohol is going to evaporate rather quickly into the air, and it's going to leave those constituents that we extracted penetrating a little bit deeper in the skin than an aqueous extract would, which the skin is a little bit more repellent to water. And so with my topical formulas, the patent is actually an amphiphilic patent. So it's a bond of water and oil together held in solution. And that's really important because our body works off of a water oil bond. Our cells have a lipid bilayer that have that water and oil loving side of them. And our skin responds really, really well in terms of absorption when it has a water and an oil bond. And so when we're applying something topically, we need to understand how the skin reacts under different circumstances so that we can make sure that we're getting those absorption. I use targeting herbs, some that really target what are called the endocytic vesicles of the cell. And essentially, you can think of those as the little vehicles that drive things in and out of the cells of our body. And so I always try and use plants that particularly target endocytic vesicles, and I make sure that I add those into every single one of my topicals. So I give them a little ride deeper into the body, and that's part of that understanding how things move in and out of our body. And we can do that on various levels. We can do that in a spiritual sense, like our mental thoughts and energies that are moving in and out of our body, and then on a physical sense, how things are moving in and out of our bodies.
Yeah. What
So two of my favorites to add to just about everything are rosemary and lavender. Those things really have a deep, and I use the essential oils because I'm having that monoterpene oil bond. And I find that those two, when they are in my topicals, those become the most effective formulas. And so I use those for conditions that, like, for instance, like fibromyalgia. So we have a formula we make specifically for fibromyalgia. And I really want to like target because most people, when they're having fibromyalgia, this is again, there's science to back this up, and there's science to say fibromyalgia comes from several different places, and there's some debate. But it is my belief that at one point in time, somebody had an attack from a virus or an illness inside the body. They got better, or they thought they did, but that virus really found somewhere in their joints to kind of hang out and hide. If we think about like where mold and bacteria likes to grow in dark, damp places, our joints can be some of those kind of dark, damp places. And so with our fibromyalgia formula, I really focused on targeting things that were going to kind of drive into those cellular fluids, for instance, and take my herbs there so we can kind of expel what has gotten stuck and stagnant. And I like to think about most, especially when it comes to pain, that something's stuck and stagnant in the body. Yeah, oftentimes it can be energetic. I'm a big fan of Dr. Cowan, if anybody out there is a Dr. Cowan, and so he does not believe in viruses.
Mhm.
And I have to agree with him on many, many levels that he's very much onto something. And he was an anthroposophic doctor as well. And but we do know that there is some type of entity that is lodging within the body, and we have to find our way to expel it. And so, um, you can look at, like, if you're really interested in which plants target endocytic vesicles, you can use plant monographs. I do have some favorite books, of course, that have like really wonderful plant monographs that talk about the science behind them and what their epigenetic influence is. And then their subcellular localization, where they have found that those plants rest within the body. And that's where you get really into the science. And there's a lot of herbal product companies out there, and a lot of them make really great products. But we have to understand that also everybody's different. And while one herb may work really, really well for me, it's not necessarily going to work really, really well for somebody else. And I love to use the example of black cohosh because for a while that was a very, very popular herb to give to women when they were going through
Mhm.
menopause. And some women actually experienced really bad side effects from the black cohosh. It had a very like bad reaction within their body. And this is where I love traditional Chinese medicine because when they're looking at selecting herbs for somebody, they're looking at the energetics of the herb itself and the energetics of the person. So they're looking at whether a plant is hot or cold, whether it's damp or dry. Is it moistening to the body? Is it nourishing to the body? And then looking at the person's energetics, and do they have what they would call like a yin deficiency? So do they have damage to the fluids of the body? And if that's the case, I would want to give them an herb that's nourishing and supportive to the body's fluids. I wouldn't want to give them an herb that's hot and dry. And that's where people are having the problem with the black cohosh. They have that damaged fluids or the damaged yin of the body, and they're taking an herb that's hot and dry. And so they're exasperating their issue by taking the wrong herb. And so when we're talking about herbal medicine, we need to think about it not just in terms of like, oh, well, these plant constituents have scientific evidence to show that they're helpful for hot flashes. That's great. But we have to look at the person as an individual as well and understand what is taking place in their body because every woman who experiences hot flashes it didn't necessarily experience those because of the same root cause. We can have two different root causes and then they manifest into what we would call the same disease or dis-ease in the body, but their root cause is different. And we have to address root causes, not diseases. When we're focusing solely on treating diseases, that's when we're not really addressing the person as an individual who has these little idiosyncrasies that got them to maybe the same disease, but their root cause is different.
So that's really interesting from the traditional Chinese medicine perspective. Do you also, because I know that you practice astrology, do you also look at the astrological aspects of the plant and the client that you would be prescribing it to?
Only on a rare occasion. And it's usually when it's somebody who's a client of mine that knows that I do astrology because I don't often promote that. And then when it comes to looking at somebody's astrological chart, I feel like there's something one, you have to have the information of their birth information to look
Yeah.
at it to begin with. And then two, I feel that I have to have permission from the person. I feel like that's a looking glass into their deeper karmic history. And so even people who I see as clients, and they'll ask me if they're just call me up and ask me questions. If they're a friend of mine, and they're like, "Well, have you looked at my chart?" Well, if you give me permission, I'll look at it. I don't go around peeking at my friends' charts, like
Right.
seeing what's going on in their life. But I do find that astrology has many places in medicine. Um, Sometimes, especially when I'm meeting with clients, there's so many other things to cover that we're not necessarily always looking at the astrological influences. But I do agree with some of the ancients that you do absolutely have to have a strong background in astrology to understand the plants and their energies. And if you are focusing, which I think when I started my herbal path, that was one of the things that I really was interested in was the right timing to give the right remedy under
Mhm.
the right astrological occurrences. Because I do believe that a medicine can be more effective taking it one time at the right astrological alignment when it's astrologically aligned to your chart than if you take that medicine every single day for a year and
Mhm.
never get that one day. But then also in a clinical sense, what am I supposed to like tell my client? Okay, well, I pulled your electional astrology chart for this medicine and it is in January 12th of 2026. So I need you to wait next year to take this herb. That's not realistic.
Right.
And usually in that sense, and I think most people, especially in like biodynamic farming, because I make biodynamic calendars for using biodynamic preps for a close circle of some of my friends who are into biodynamic farming and really appreciate my more kind of different perspective than some of the Demeter calendars. And so, in a clinical sense, you're more likely to use the lunar transits to give somebody an herbal remedy versus looking for this like exact perfect astrological alignment because those can be few and far between. And even in like the creation of some biodynamic calendars for planting and for applying the preparations, when I'm looking an entire year ahead, I sometimes I'll get stuck in a month going round and round about trying to find in a month like the right place to apply certain applications because you can get astrological weather that is just it's not friendly for doing anything, particularly
Mhm.
medicine. Um, and then other times where you can have just really beautiful moments for taking medicine. I think that one of those things, if you want to use herbal medicine according to astrology, that's something that is really personal. And if you've studied astrology and then you can study the plans. I was talking to somebody the other day, like, how do you identify a planet to a particular plant? And I use nettle as an example.
Mhm.
Think about
Good.
nettle. It's got
Yes.
this sting and this bite, right? And it puts this kind of like fomic acid poison into you, which is actually a really great medicine, and people can use it to treat arthritis and all the kinds of stuff. If you can tolerate the daily application of nettle to a certain area, it can really reduce that inflammation in a joint. And
Yeah.
like brave people who do that, and more power to you. But if you think about that plant, it's easy to associate it's planetary alignment, with Mars, with that sting and with that bite. And that but other plants might be a little bit hard because like when you think about the planet Saturn, you kind of think of like cold and restrictive. So I like to think of restrictive as astringent, which is
Mhm.
a plant property. So it can be very astringent and tightening, kind of like think like witch hazel, right?
Mhm.
When you apply witch hazel to your skin, what do you feel? This cool, tightening aspect to the plant. And so, but this is also where you get those charts of correspondences where you have different people disagreeing about which plant is really aligned to which planet. And so it's always a tricky place. And I'll use an example from my personal life. I remember the first time that a plant spoke to me and told me its name. And I was out in one of my favorite places in the wild where I just liked to go to be with nature and was sitting by this river and just staring at this lovely plant that I found so intriguing and just was really mesmerized by it. And the plant told me its name. And I was like, and so I took note of it. And then when I got back to quote unquote civilization, I looked the plant up on my phone and was really surprised that the plant had told me its name. It was like this shocking moment. But I think people have those kind of clear moments. I know one of my herbalist teachers told a story in class of the time that a plant first showed him its medicine. And he had been really struggling with a client of his that he had been working with for a long time who had kidney failure. And he had used all of his herbs in his repertoire and just really troubled by this person's declining state and
Mm.
wanted to do something to help him. And he had remembered that one of his elder teachers had told him that the plants will talk to you in the wind. And he said he looked around and it was just a hot day without a drop of wind or movement anywhere around him. And it was one of those days where he said you would pray for the wind to blow to cool you off. And he was sitting outside thinking about this client. And all of a sudden noticed that there was this plant off in the distance and it was wrestling and moving and shaking. And he kind of looked around surprised, nothing else was moving, and then approached this plant and it was nettles. And he said, "Well, I know what nettles used for. It's not going to help my client with their kidneys." And the plant said to him, "No, not my leaves, my seeds." Now, nettle seed is not known to be used in herbal medicine. And so he collected some of the plant seeds. I went back and made an extract and gave it to his client. And he said, "I'm going to go out on a limb here. And I need you to go out on a limb with me and not think that I'm crazy. But this plant told me to use its seeds. It's not something that and nobody's ever used this in medicine before, but I want you to try this." The person's kidney, and forget the exact numbers, but she was at some like very, very low level of like 12% kidney function or something like that. And she was through the use of that medicine, she got up to like 21% kidney function and held at that place for a good 7 years. And the numbers may be off because I don't remember exactly what they were, but it was a discovery of his, of a medicine that he now uses very frequently in his practice because he has found nettle seed to be extremely effective at helping to support people, especially in late stage kidney failure. And so the plants do talk. I think sometimes we as humans have to learn to listen.
Yeah. That is, it's something that we used to do more of, right? And that many indigenous people still do. And the curanderos, medicine men and women, in the Amazons, they still have that connection with the plants and the jungle, um, and we're starting to appreciate it now, finally. But maybe, hopefully not too late. Um, yeah, and wow. So let's go to this application of the plants, because you did talk about how you've selected the topical application to avoid problems with the metabolic system. And going through the skin, well, the skin is our boundary, right? It's our boundary to the outside. And we don't think of it as an absorptive surface, but of course it is. Um, and it also has like a lot of, yeah, soul spiritual sensing, right? Like it's not just like touch is one of the most primitive senses. And yeah, go into that a little bit. Like, how did you get to using the skin, and how did you develop the formulations like that would go in deeper, like not just the scientific approach, but the more esoteric approach?
So I'll start by saying that our skin absorbs so much more than we realize. And I actually believe that that is the number one pathway to toxins in the body. Our metabolic system and our digestive system is set up to remove toxins that we ingest. We have several different organs for eliminating those toxins. We
Right,
have our kidneys, we
right.
have our liver. We have ways to remove those toxins. And our skin definitely has its barrier protective modalities. For instance, if you're going to apply sunscreen, you're supposed to wait until you've been exposed to the sun for at least 30 minutes before applying that, because it allows the body to activate its natural defenses, which is going to create a tougher barrier for anything to penetrate. And so that sunscreen is going to sit on the surface of your skin instead of
Mhm.
being absorbed deep into your tissues. If you're at home and you're preparing to go to the beach and you apply that sunscreen, it's like applying lotion. It's moisturizing your skin. All of those toxins, all of those chemicals are going right into your body. And then you go out into the sun and your body activates its defenses, seals itself off, and just sealed off inside that sunscreen in you. And it's really not doing the protection that you think it's doing. And so part of my dive into making these topical products was kind of having a learning and a loving of my skin and really starting to understand that it's not just this thing that covers my body. And I think one of the most fascinating things that I learned was when I saw this study that if you removed the human body but left all of the bacteria and microbes that was living on the surface of your skin, that it would like leave behind an exact shell and replica of the human body. And it really made me think about my skin as this living earth. And if you go back to the axiom of where the microcosm of the macrocosm, that you're this earth and this is the surface. And there are all kinds of things living on and feeding off of the surface. And we don't usually think about ourselves as our dead skin cells feeding these living life forms, but they are. And when we get kind of over that initial like kind of grossed out factor of the fact that things are living on and eating our dead skin and actually start to appreciate it from a different perspective and say, wow, that's really beautiful. I am a living earth organism, and on the surface of my skin are all these beings that I'm caring for and I'm tending for. And so when I apply stuff to that surface of the skin, it's kind of like when we apply pesticides or herbicides to the surface of the earth, like what's happening to those organisms that are living on that surface. And so it started with a journey of just loving and nourishing my own skin instead of ignoring it and neglecting it as something that's just there holding a shell in place.
What did you find was like, yeah, the mechanism that you were gonna use, not just the, you mentioned the endocytosis, things that help things go in, the medicine go in deeper, but there's also another process that you studied.
So I'm not entirely sure what you're probing at because there's a couple things that come to
Okay.
mind. So one really is the use of what we call a silicon plasma hydrate. And so silicon is the precursor to silica, which a lot of people know as sand or quartz crystal. And I want to point out the importance of silica on our earth. 99% of rocks are made up of silica. And there's actually a carbon sequestration, didn't say that word too well, cycle that is taking place every single day that has to do with silica in the environment. So as rocks are exposed to the sun and weathering, the little bits of silica contained within the rocks actually bond with the carbon in the air and are washed away in the water. And there's entire scientific studies done on sea life based upon this carbon cycle of the silica. And the silica is carried into the water. And there is an organism on Earth that is not a carbon-based life form. It is an entirely silica-based life form, and most people are familiar with it as a garden product called diatomaceous earth. And that is an entirely silica-based life form, which is an interesting concept because we kind of think of life as carbon-based, that a life form can live entirely off of the silica. And its importance in the human body, there's no way to state its importance in our bone formation, in our elastin, our cartilage, our health of our skin, our teeth, our hair, our nails. Everything requires this kind of backbone strengthening structure of silica. And when we're babies and we're born and our bones have not hardened and solidified, they're majorly made up of silica. And that is slowly replaced with the calcium that calcifies or hardens our
Mhm.
bones. And so I became really fascinated with the application of the silica and how it can help to rebuild and restore. And so it started off with a journey of just plain orthosilicic acid by itself, And then we have a proprietary process that we do in our lab that turns it into what we call a plasma. And when I refer to plasma, I refer to like Gerald Pollack's, fourth phase of water. So
Mhm.
most people are familiar with water as solid, liquid, and gaseous. There's actually a fourth phase of water, and that's in a plasma gel-like state. And this is really important because plasma conducts electromagnetic energy. And the fluids in our body, depending upon your fluid ratio, that if you're dehydrated, of course, it's going to be lower, higher, if you're well hydrated. So the water contained within the human body is somewhere around the neighborhood of 80% plasma state versus liquid state. And if you get really into the science of and look at the human body in like an anatomy book, you'll notice a couple of things. You'll notice one, nerve ends don't actually touch end to
Mhm.
end. They have anion gaps. And the capillary beds of our body as well, our blood vessels don't actually touch end to end. There's a fluid in between them, and these signals and everything is crossing over these fluids. That's a plasma fluid, and it has this beautiful ability to conduct electromagnetic energy. And so in my early stages of the research with this silicon plasma, we found that it actually had the ability to alter those electromagnetic signals of the body. And one of our research subjects that we did was with people who were amputees. And one of the things that amputees suffer with is what's called phantom pains. And there is no pharmaceutical medicine on the market that can help them with their phantom pains. And they can really suffer pretty
Mhm.
significantly. Imagine having an itch that you can't itch because the limb is no longer there. And so this is where science meets spirituality. We talked about this before we got on camera, the
Mhm.
explanation of what I would call the etheric body, what in Eastern traditions is often called the prana or the energy body or your life body. And so understanding this magnetic reconnection for the amputees and why our silica plasma gel was able to stop their phantom pains in as little as 2 to 3 minutes. You have to understand that when we removed the physical limb, we didn't remove the energetic limb. That mirror of the physical body and the energetic body was still there. And so the body was sending signals to that etheric or life body or energy body, whatever you want to refer to it as if it was still there. And so by having this plasma gel that can help reform those electrical magnetic signals, that is my belief that what it was doing in our studies with people who had had something amputated was that it was actually reconnecting that signal between the etheric body and the physical body so that the body recognized that that limb wasn't there. And the amazing thing about the topical preparation, because there's other herbs and other things that are in there as well that help to target nerve ending signals and other pain and inflammation. So we kind of give a well-rounded approach to somebody's pain when they've had an amputation. The amazing thing about it is that the people who used the topical saw less and less and less occurrences of their phantom pains until they became so few and far between that they hardly got them at all. Because that application just helped to kind of restructure those signals, in my belief. It's something hard that's hard to prove.
Mhm.
No, until we have like really concrete ways to measure that energetic body, which science is kind of starting to get there. We have to actually have measurements and tools that do measure that energetic body of the human being. But until we have like a really concrete way in the lab to like show what's happening, it's my feeling and my perspective based upon my um spiritual trainings and my medical training and everything kind of coming to that culmination. And so I think that was part of what really kept drawing me into creating more and more topicals and kind of broadening the offerings that I gave with a large focus of helping people with their pain. 90% of our topicals that we sell are all focused on different types of pain. And that goes back to the energetics of the hot, the cold, and the TCM that we were talking about before my internet connection kind of cut
Mhm.
me off a little bit there is no two people's pain is the same. And so that's why I have so many different formulas on just geared towards pain, is because what works for one person may not necessarily take the pain away from another person. And so we're kind of tweaking those energetics. Maybe somebody needs that like really warm, dry, because they have kind of like a moist swelling condition of their joint. And so I want to have something that's warming and drying for them. Or maybe somebody's got that kind of hot inflammation and we need to cool it down. And so the silica became this delivery method for herbs that drove it deep into the cells. And then there's this other really magical sciencey term called Dalton size. Essentially, it refers to the molecular size of
Mm-hmm.
a molecule. And so what we did is we altered our molecular size so that we had some of our ingredients of our topicals that we knew would stay on the surface of the skin to moisturize and nourish the surface. And then some that had a really small Dalton size so that it would cross beyond that skin, blood, brain barrier
Mm-hmm.
and get really deep into the tissues. And so that's where like the science came in, and I'm a lover of science, and so I love like getting really deep into those rabbit holes and finding this balance of healing in the middle for people where they can have a kind of an energetic healing in a topical, because we're talking about the energetic body and working on how those magnetic connections are speaking to each other in within our own human body. And then we could have that really physical healing that focuses maybe on the nerve damage or the muscular damage, or repairing those elastin connections in the body as well. And so it's a multi-layered approach. And that's what I love about anthroposophy and
Mm-hmm.
anthroposophical medicine is you're looking at all of those layers, but you're also looking at the individual person as a being themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's hard to encapsulate it, but there's, that when we only think about, in Western medicine, when we only think about the physical, and we try to assign everyone a condition and take this medicine for this condition, that's when we get into all of the trouble that we have gotten into with side effects, with medications not working, with, um, yeah, long-term use of medicines that are just so. We don't take the individual into account. And, it's like there's the physical, there's the etheric or life force body, then there's the more what astral, but it's really the emotional and it's the soul of the person, right? And then of course the spirit that's coming in and animating everything. Um and for me, this is something that, when I discovered anthroposophic medicine, I was completely in love with it. It's not the easiest to explain always, but it is a very individualized approach. And I think that more and more people are appreciating that we can't do the one size fits all medicine, that we're not numbers, we're not statistics. Yeah. And even though you may have a large randomized controlled study that shows 30% improvement in 50% of the people, that leaves a lot that's not taken care of. Right.
A
And,
lot of
and
people, yeah.
Yeah, and to understand, well, what is it exactly? What are we missing out? And you're right. This is where an approach such as anthroposophic medicine help. But traditional Chinese medicine also has strengths, as does Ayurvedic medicine, and many of these old systems that uh, are now finally coming to our attention. It's not just new. It's been a few decades now in the Western world, but it's totally, I think, the wave of the future that we can individualize medicine more.
I think that's where it has to go. We have to, from not just a physical but also a spiritual sense, recognize the individual and the individual's path. And this was something that really hit me like full in the face in my clinical practice. I had a client who had a number of serious medical conditions, and she came to me because she really wanted off of all of her pharmaceutical drugs. And I had to have, like, there are limits as to what we can do. She had had half of her thyroid removed. That's a hard thing when you've had surgery removing a good portion of a necessary organ.
Sure.
It's hard for a plant. If you still have the organ intact, it's a lot different. We can work on healing and restoring and supportive forces, but when something's missing, it's a lot harder to come in from a natural perspective and to completely 100% support somebody. We were able to over time. And that's what I explained to her. I said, it's going to take time because we have to heal and restore, and then we have to really work on a very strong regimen to support. So, anyway, she had a number of things going on. And we had really worked. I would say we were at like that good 65% off of her pharmaceutical drugs that she had wanted. And I had worked with her primary care physician to carefully taper her off as we increased the herbs that could do the same thing that some of those drugs were doing. And she was doing really well, but I had this like feeling that we were missing the mark a little bit, especially when it came to her issues with sleep. Now, issues with sleep are far more embedded in a psychological, emotional state of a being. And they're definitely not a one size fit all. And it wasn't until I had worked with this person for a long time and that they opened up to me and told me um, that they were really struggling inside because their child had committed suicide, and they felt very, very guilty as a mother. And as a mother myself, I could completely empathize with her. And it was also this striking moment that I suddenly knew what herb was the right herb for her, and that was motherwort, and that was for the wounded mother inside of her, and that she really needed support was there, and that all of these other health conditions had come along because there was this deep-seated emotional wound. And I like to explain emotional wounds to people in the same way that you would think of a wound on your skin. If you imagine that you have a wound on your arm and you don't take care of it, and it gets infected and it festers and it starts to form pus and it doesn't heal and it starts to spread and take over other healthy tissue and infect other areas of the body. An emotional wound is the same thing within our body. If an emotional wound is not properly dealt with and expressed and allowed to heal, it will fester inside of the body and can create dis-ease within the organism. And so I always, after that moment in time, I knew that from my training, but it wasn't as strongly seated in me. But I recognized at that moment that as a healer, I was never going to be able to help anyone on their path to their healing unless I also worked on what was the root cause of emotional trauma within them. And we all have those emotional, or we can call them karmic circumstances within us that can create the circumstances in which disease can thrive. And I think that's really important because science has shown that 95% of disease is not from a genetic cause. There's very, very few instances in which somebody is predisposed genetically for a condition. So there has to be some other underlying factor. And if we think about like the argument with vaccines, how can one child get a vaccine and not have a reaction, and how can another? You relate it back to science, and we can say their detox systems, their metabolic pathways, their body was able to move those toxins out without an effect versus the other. But I also would beg to differ that we're just dealing with the physical. You're forgetting those other three bodies that you mentioned, Elizabeth. You mentioned, a soul, a spirit, and then the energy body. And we have to take into consideration where is the disalignment in all of the person. And so that's where we have to have that individualized medical approach, because we have to be able to, as a practitioner, be able to address the soul, the spiritual, the physical, and the energetic aspects of an individual if we want to truly help our clients receive total healing. And if we think back, go back 1,000 years in time to what would have been like the doctors of the time, like they were expected to have a background and training in astrology prior to even being admitted into medical school. They were required to have their own herb garden because they needed to grow those herbs and have that relationship and a deeper understanding of them. And then they could train to help people. And I would say that, I don't think this point is in any of the books I've ever read, but I would beg to differ that those people probably had to have like a deep training in psychology to understand the emotional side of things too. So you could target all four of those. But it points out that the role of a doctor is not just somebody who's gone through medical school. The role of the doctor is a very intense and deep one in which we have to be able to see the entire human being and not just a diagnosis on a piece of paper.
100%. Yeah. One of the biggest things that struck me when I did the anthroposophic medicine training, I think in the very first week of the training, was how much focus we had on inner work, right? Getting to know oneself. And because if you don't know yourself, then actually it's also hard to meet the self in the other and to recognize what is actually meeting you versus what are you projecting, right? Yeah. So it is very deep work. And I remember reflecting and thinking, wow, I think this needs to be a requirement before anybody goes into medical school. Somehow we need to put this first and then comes the medicine. But yeah, that's
If you
completely
talk to
po-
any healer or shaman or anybody like that, the one thing that you will notice is that they had a journey to their own healing before they became a healer. And I always that's the second time I've said the word healer in this podcast because I recognized it the first time and I don't usually like to refer to myself as a healer because I'm not the healer. The plants are the healer and you are your own healer because you are the only one who can really truly heal yourself. I'm just a guide on your journey that knows the plants. And so I share the plant wisdom with you, but I can't heal you. There's nothing that I can do to actually physically heal you. I can just offer you some guidance along your journey to your own personal healing. But the beautiful thing about being in the position of helping people to heal themselves is that we have been through that journey ourselves. And I do a lot of podcast shows. And so one of the favorite questions that people ask me when we start off with our introduction is, how did you get to where you are today? And I share a decade-long journey of my own personal healing, and then my journey of healing my autistic child. And that's what led me deep into the path of understanding how we actually function as a human being and having to step outside of the traditional medical realm that didn't give any answers or said there is no answer.
Mhm.
And this deep feeling inside of myself that said, no, I know there is an answer out there. I don't know what it is right now, but I'm going to find it. And that's the key. When you go to somebody, when you're looking for a doctor or a healer, you are looking for somebody that recognizes that you may not have all the answers right now, but those answers are within you. You just need somebody to help pull them out from the depths of your own knowing and your own being.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of looking at it. Yeah. So, wow. And tell us a little bit more about your healing journey. I know it's coming towards the end of the usual, but now you've got me curious. Yeah.
Mine started out when I was a teenager and I was sick in and out of the hospitals. I was bleeding internally and I was not feeling well. So we'll date myself here so that we're talking 27 years ago. Um, and the doctor looked at my mom and said, well, we really don't have any answers, but there's this theory going around that some people are allergic to this thing called gluten. And so you might want to try taking it out of her diet. In fact, this is way before the gluten-free craze. I mean, I remember my mom used to drive about half hour away from our hometown to this kind of more like really kind of hippie town that was like on the cutting edge of things. And she would buy this bread that was gluten-free and it tasted awful. It was like a brick. Never understood why she bought it because I just was like, I don't even want to eat this, Mom. But she didn't know what else to feed me in comparison to my siblings who she could make a sandwich for. And she couldn't make a sandwich for me. And so it was a difficult struggle for her to figure out how to take that out of a diet. But it made a huge difference in for me. And so it was the starting point of understanding that our food can affect our health. And you're talking about a 14-year-old child starting to recognize that something's wrong with our food. Back in a day and age when people didn't really talk a lot about organic food and there wasn't all of this media and press about what we eat and where it gets us. And so it wasn't until I went away to college and I was living in Chicago and I met a lot more kind of alternative people who had seen other things in the world than I had seen in my small Midwestern town. And they were eating organic and they were growing their own food. And I remember just being completely fascinated and really wanting to know what they knew. And so that was the start of growing my own food, eating organic, changing my dietary lifestyle. And it just made such a drastic difference in my mental function, in my emotional state, in my skin, in my health, in my weight, in every aspect. It just food is so vitally important to our health. You know, we are what we eat. What we put into our bodies is going to be the chemical makeup of our bodies. And so that was the start of my journey. And I think as you kind of go down that rabbit hole into those more alternative worlds, then, you know, the universe brings people along your life and your life path that you need to meet. And so I remember like my first wise old woman that taught me about herbal medicine. And I remember some of my first plants because it was wild yam and chasteberry or chasteberry, however you say it in your part of the country. And these are two really strong feminine herbs that can help to alter those kind of chemical disturbances in the body that can cause some of our premenstrual problems and other issues as women. And so those were some of my first herb introductions. And then life just kind of continued on that path until I had my first child. And at age 5, she was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And I'll preface to everybody, she was not vaccinated. So there was no vaccines as like the cause. And it was a really shocking moment for me. I remember sitting in her pediatrician's office and her pediatrician literally said to me, "There's nothing you can do about it. This is just the way she's going to be for the rest of her life." And I heard the voice in my head that says, "No, I don't agree with that. I know there's something I can do and I'm going to find out what that is." And it was a 10-year journey of working with holistic psychiatrists and holistic pediatricians and DAN doctors. And you name it, I took my daughter there because I was bound and determined that she was going to be a healthy, happy, normal person who could live a life. I mean, I remember people telling me, oh, she's never going to hold a job. She's never going to have friends. She's never going to do this. She's never going to do that. And there were certainly moments in her healing journey where I was like, I don't know if she's ever going to, but I have to keep trying no matter what. And it was through that 10-year long journey that I learned so much about how the human body functions and where damage can come from and how we have to heal it. And I'll say too, like some of that I do believe goes back to that karmic aspect of things. You know, she grew up in what you would think would be that chemical-free circumstances. You know, she wasn't vaccinated. We lived out in farm country on our own farm. We grew our organic food. She wasn't exposed to chemicals. We had a freshwater spring that was coming out of the side of a mountain that we got our water from. I mean, you have this like totally like perfect scenario, right? So how do you have a child that ends up autistic? Because in most of our frame thinking about how we think of kids who are autistic, we think of certain set of chemicals and stuff that cause that.
Mm.
And I'll tell you the one thing, because we are running out of time, that I found was actually what I believe the cause of it. It's yeast bacterial overgrowth. How we start off in our body and our lives. A whole discuss that would have to have a whole episode on how
Okay.
that happens.
Yeah.
Is there was a study that I came across from a doctor at the CDC, and he found that all these children's urine analysis tests that came into the CDC had something in common. They had extremely elevated levels of tartaric acid. What is tartaric acid? I'm going to simplify it. There's more science to this, but for the sake of this,
Mhm.
we're going to call it yeast pee because
Mm.
everything pees and poops, right? And so if you have yeast in you, you have to assume it's defecating inside of your body, right? And tartaric acid is a neurotoxin that destroys the myelin sheath of the brain. And so one of the treatments that I did with my daughter that was so highly effective was a treatment for yeast bacterial overgrowth in the body. That made a huge difference. And so things are never as cut and dry and simple as we hear them in the media. Life is far more messy when we get down to the
Yeah,
nitty-gritty. And that's where you have to look at the individual person. And I always like
exactly.
for the rest of my life will thank that doctor at the CDC who I think he lost his job eventually. Who found that study and really paved a pathway for people to understand some of the other possibilities that are causing some of these neurodegenerative diseases.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I wasn't aware of it. But yeah, there are so many things that lead down to the same outcome. We know this in medicine, right? Like how many things can lead down the inflammatory pathway to damage, right? There are many starting points, and that's the key, finding the starting point for each individual so that you can actually treat the root cause. And sometimes that is at the soul level, at the emotional level. Sometimes it is karmic, genetic, you know. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge. And I know that, you have these products, and I'll put the link down in the show notes, how to reach your website and your store. Are your products available um, throughout the US and the world, or where is it?
Yeah, so we do ship throughout the entire US and internationally. There are some countries, of course, that have restrictions on what you can ship internationally, but we ship to the UK, to Australia, and to other countries. That's going to be an individual. Usually, I call them bath products. Say that they're body lotion because
Uh,
it gets it across customs if you call it a body lotion. So we haven't had any troubles as of yet with customs, putting it under that kind of category. And that's what it is categorized here in the U.S. as is we're a cosmetic company because topical products are not considered supplements; they're considered cosmetics. Um, and so you can find me at my herbal products company is Herbal, or I do have a main website that's bonniedarkangelo.com. So that's my name without the apostrophe. And on there, you find links to everything. You can find links to my YouTube channel, to my Instagram page. I am a lover of sharing plant wisdom and showing you videos of me with my kids in my garden. So if you like little kids eating flowers and leaves from plants because my 3-year-old son will eat any plant that we're talking about on a video to show the people on the video that it's totally edible.
Love it.
You can follow me there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. It was wonderful.
Thanks. And for the listeners and watchers, if you enjoyed this content, please share it and subscribe. It really helps the podcasts get greater reach.